It is with diffidence that I talk to you tonight. The events that I'm about to relate are so extraordinary that I'm quite prepared to meet with incredulity, quite prepared to meet with scorn. And I accept all that beforehand. I have, I trust, the courage to face unbelief. I live in a curious old house, which has enjoyed for some time the reputation of being haunted. It's a large, stately residence surrounded by what was once a garden, but which is now only a green enclosure used for bleaching clothes. The dry basin of what was once a fountain and a few ragged fruit trees indicate that in past days this was a pleasant and shady retreat. And the house is very spacious. The hall leads to a spiral staircase winding through its centre, while the various apartments are of imposing dimensions. It was built 20 years ago by a well-known merchant, Mr. Tobias Anstruther, who you probably remember 5 years ago threw the commercial world into convulsions by a stupendous bank fraud. And Mr. Anstruther fled the country soon after that and died alone of a broken heart. And almost as soon as the news of his decease reached his native land, the report spread that his former home was haunted. It was then inhabited solely by a caretaker and his wife, placed there by the house agent. Now, this couple declared that they were constantly troubled with unnatural noises. Doors were opened without any visible agency. The remnants of furniture scattered through the various rooms were during the night piled up on one another by unknown hands. Invisible feet passed up and down the stairs in broad daylight, accompanied by the rustle of unseen silk dresses. One day, the caretaker and his wife announced that they could live there no longer. The house agent laughed, dismissed them, and put others in their place. And the noise and the supernatural manifestations continued. Now, the neighbourhood soon caught up with the story, and the house remained untenanted for 3 years. Several people did negotiate for it, but somehow, before the bargain was closed, they always heard the unpleasant rumours, and they declined to treat any further. And that was the state of things when my landlady, Mrs. Moffat, conceived the bold idea of taking on the building herself. Now, happening to have in her current house a plucky and philosophical set of boarders, she laid her scheme before us, stating candidly everything that she'd heard about the ghostly qualities of the establishment to which she wished to remove us. Now, with the exception of 2 timid persons, a sea captain and a taxidermist who immediately gave notice that they would leave, all of Mrs. Moffat's guests determined to accompany her in her bold incursion into the abode of spirits. We moved there in May, and we were instantly all charmed with our new residence. The air was pure and invigorating, and the garden which surrounded the house, although long neglected and displaying on washing days rather too much clothesline, it still gave us a cool retreat in the summer evenings. Now, of course, we had no sooner established ourselves there than we began to expect ghosts. In fact, we awaited their advent with positive eagerness. Our dinner conversations are always supernatural. One of the boarders who had purchased Mrs. Crow's Night Side of Nature for his own private delectation was regarded as a public enemy for not having bought copies for the entire household. And I myself found, I became a person of immense importance, I must say, when it was discovered that I was tolerably well versed in the history of supernaturalism, and in fact had once published a story, the foundation of which was a ghost. If a table or wainscot panel happened to warp when we were gathered in the large drawing room, there was an instant silence. And we braced ourselves for an immediate clanking of chains and the appearance of a spectral form. Now, after a month of psychological overexcitement, it was with the utmost dissatisfaction that we were all forced to admit that nothing in the remotest degree supernatural had yet manifested itself. I mean, one tenant swore that his candle had been blown out by some invisible agency, but he was a notorious tippler. And things were in this state when the incident took place, so awful and inexplicable in its character that my reason still fairly reels at the memory of it. It was the 10th of July. Now, after dinner, I'd repaired with my friend Mr. Hammond, Dr. Hammond actually, to the garden to smoke an evening pipe. Now, independent of certain mental sympathies which existed between the doctor and myself, we were linked by a particular vice. We both smoked opium. Now, we knew each other's secret, we respected it, and we enjoyed together that wonderful expansion of thought, that marvelous intensifying of the perceptive faculties, the unimaginable spiritual bliss, which I would not surrender for a throne, and which I hope you, my friends, will never be tempted to taste. Now, these secret hours of opium happiness, which the doctor and I spent together, were regulated by a scientific accuracy. We did not blindly take the drug of paradise and leave our dreams to chance. While smoking, we carefully steered our conversation through the brightest and calmest channels of thought. We talked of the East, and we endeavored to recall the magical panorama of its glowing scenery. We discussed only the most sensuous poets, those who painted life with ruddy health, brimming with passion, happy in the possession of youth and strength and beauty. If we talked of Shakespeare's Tempest, we avoided Caliban and we lingered on Ariel. And you see that this skillful colouring of our thoughts produced in our subsequent visions a correspondingly sunny tone. The splendours of Arabian fairyland dyed our dreams. Houses, walls, and streets melted like rain clouds, and vistas of unimaginable glory stretched away before us. It was a rapturous companionship, and we enjoyed the vast delight more perfectly because even in our most ecstatic moments, we were conscious of each other's presence. Our pleasures, while individual, were still twin, vibrating and moving in musical accord. Now, on the evening in question, as I say, it was the 10th of July, the doctor and I drifted into an unusually metaphysical mood. We lit our large meerschaums, filled with Turkish tobacco, in the core of which burned a little black nut of opium, and we paced the garden to and fro, conversing. Now, a strange perversity dominated the currents of our thought that evening. They did not flow through the usual sunlit channels into which we strove to divert them. For some accountable reason, they kept heading into dark and lonesome beds where a continual gloom brooded. It was in vain that we flung ourselves on the shores of the East. We talked of gay bazaars, of the splendours of the time of Haroun, of harems and golden palaces. Black afrits, however, continually arose from the depth of our talk and expanded until they blotted out everything bright from our vision. And insensibly, we yielded to the occult force that swayed us, and we began to indulge in gloomy speculations. I mean, we talked for some time upon the proneness of the human mind to mysticism and the almost universal love of the terrible, when Hammond suddenly said, "Harry, what do you consider to be the greatest element of terror?" Well, that was the question that made me pause. I mean, that many things were terrible, I knew. Stumbling over a corpse in the dark, for instance, or beholding, as I once did, a woman floating down a river with wildly lifted arms and an awful upturned face, shrieking, while we spectators stood frozen at a window 60 feet above the river, utterly unable to help her and dumbly watching her last supreme agony and then disappearance, a shattered wreck with no life visible, encountered floating listlessly on the ocean is a fearful object, because that suggests a huge terror, the proportions of which are veiled. But it was only when Hammond asked that question that it struck me for the first time that there must be one great and ruling embodiment of fear, a king of terrors, so to speak, to which all others must succumb. But what might it be? To what train of circumstances would it owe its existence? Well, I've got to say, Hammond, I replied at last, that I've never considered that before. I mean, there must be something more terrible than any other thing. I feel sure of that, but I can't attempt even the most vague definition. I'm the same, Harry, he said. No, I too sense a capacity within myself to experience a terror greater than anything yet conceived by man. I mean, much is terrible, of course, in Poe or Bulwer Lytton, but there must be something more horrible than these fictions. There was something unimagined. He shook his head gloomily. Well, all right, Hammond, I said. Please, let's drop this kind of talk, though, for heaven's sake. We shall suffer for it, you know. I know, Harry, I know. I'm sorry. I don't know what's got on with me tonight. My brain is running along all sorts of weird and awful thoughts. I feel like I could write a story like Hoffman tonight if I only found the words. Well, or if you're going to be Hoffman-esque, then I'm off to bed, Hammond. Opium and nightmare should never mix. Good night, my friend. Good night, Harry, and pleasant dreams to you. Yeah, and to you, gloomy wretch, of freaks, ghouls, and enchanters. We parted then, and we each sought our respective chambers. Now, I undressed quickly, turned down the gas, and got into bed. The room is in total darkness. I mean, the atom of gas that remained alight did not illuminate a distance of 3 inches around the burner, and I resolved that I'd try to go to sleep at once. I drew my arm across my eyes as if to shut out even the darkness, and I tried to think of nothing. But that was all in vain. The confounded themes touched on by Hammond in the garden kept obtruding themselves into my brain. I mean, I battled against them. I erected ramparts of would-be blackness of intellect to keep them out, and yet still they crowded in. And it was while I was lying there, still as a corpse, hoping that by a perfect physical inaction I could hasten mental repose, that the awful incident occurred. Something dropped upon me from the ceiling, plopped onto my chest, and the next instant I felt 2 bony hands encircling my throat and then tightening around it to choke me. Now, I'm not a coward, and I am possessed of considerable physical strength. And in fact, the suddenness of this attack, instead of stunning me, strung every nerve in my body to its highest tension. My body acted from instinct before my brain had time to take in the horror of the situation. And in an instant, I wound my arms around whatever it was and squeezed it with all the strength of despair against my chest. In a few seconds, the bony hands that had fastened on my throat loosened their hold, and I was free to breathe once more. And then commenced a struggle of awful intensity. Immersed in darkness, totally ignorant of the thing by which I'd been so suddenly attacked, finding my grasp slipping at every moment by reason, it seems, of the entire nakedness of my assailant, bitten with sharp teeth on the shoulder, the neck, and the chest, having at every moment to protect my throat against a pair of sinewy hands. That was a combination of circumstances to combat which required all the strength and skill and courage that I possessed. But at last, after a silent and exhausting struggle, I got my assailant under by a series of incredible efforts of strength. Once pinned with my knee on what I made out to be his chest, I knew that I'd won. and I rested then a moment to breathe. I heard the creature beneath me panting in the darkness, and I felt the violent throbbing of a heart. It was apparently as exhausted as I was. Now, at that moment, I remember that under my pillow there was a large pocket handkerchief, and in a few seconds more, I had, after a fashion, pinioned the creature's arms with this. I now felt tolerably secure. There was nothing more to be done but to turn on the gas, and having first seen who or what my midnight assailant was, then arouse the household. I mean, I will in fact confess to being actuated by certain pride in not having given the alarm before. I wished to make the capture alone and unaided. Now, never losing my hold for an instant, I slipped from the bed to the floor, dragging my captive with me. I had but a few steps to make to reach the gas burner, and these I made with the greatest caution, holding the creature all the time in a grip like a vice. At last, I got within arm's length of the tiny speck of blue light which told me where the gas burner lay. Quick as lightning, I released my grip with one hand and let on the full flood of light, and then I turned to look at my captive. Oh no. Oh. I cannot even attempt to describe my feeling the moment that I turned up the gas. I mean, I suppose that I must have shrieked in terror, because in less than a minute, my room was crowded with the other inmates of the house. I mean, I shudder even now as I think of that awful moment. Because as the gas was turned up and the light flooded the room, I saw nothing. Nothing. Yes, I had one arm firmly clasped around a breathing, panting, corporeal shape. My other hand gripped a throat as warm and apparently fleshy as my own. And yet, with this living substance in my grasp, with its body pressed up against my own, and all in the bright glare of a large jet of gas, I beheld absolutely nothing there. There was not an outline. Not even a vapor. I do not even now understand the situation in which I found myself, nor can I actually really recall it with sufficient clarity. Imagination in vain tries to encompass the awful paradox. I mean, it breathed. It felt warm upon my cheek. It struggled fiercely. It had hands. They clutched me. The skin was smooth. It was like my own. And there it lay, pressed up against me, solid as stone, and entirely invisible. I wonder that I did not go mad on the instant. I mean, some wonderful instinct must have sustained me, because instead of loosening my hold on this terrible enigma, I seemed to gain an additional strength in my moment of horror, and I tightened my grasp with such force that I felt the creature shiver with agony. And just then Hammond entered the room at the head of the household, and as soon as he beheld my face, he hastened forward. Good God, Harry, what's happened? I've been attacked! I almost shrieked. By something! And I was in bed. I've got a hold of it now. But I can't see it, Hammond. I can't see it! Hammond stepped forward with an anxious expression, but I'm afraid an audible titter burst from the remainder of my visitors, and that made me furious. To laugh at a human being in the position that I was in, it was the worst species of cruelty. Yeah, of course, now, yes, I can understand why the appearance of a man struggling violently and calling for assistance against an airy nothing might have appeared rather ludicrous. But then, so great was my rage against that mocking crowd that, had I the power, I would have stricken them dead where they stood. Hammond! For God's sake, help me. I can't hold on much longer. The thing is overpowering. Help me, man! Help me! Harry, whispered Hammond, You've been smoking too much opium. No, Hammond, I swear to you, this is not a vision. I mean, you can see for yourself how it shakes my whole frame with its struggles. Okay, if you don't believe me, feel it for yourself. Go on, man, touch it. Hammond advanced and laid his hand on the spot that I indicated, and ah! A wild cry of horror burst from him. In a moment, he discovered somewhere in my room a long piece of cord, and the next instant he was winding and knotting it around the body of the unseen being that I clasped in my hands. All right, Harry, he said, it's safe now. You can let it go. It can't move. Well, I was utterly exhausted. I gladly loosed my hold. Hammond stood holding the ends of the cord twisted around his hand, while before him, self-supporting as it were, he beheld a rope laced and interlaced and stretching tightly around a vacant space. I never saw a man look so thoroughly stricken with awe, but at the same time, his face expressed all the courage and determination which I knew him to possess. You know, his lips, although white, were set firmly, and one could perceive at a glance that although stricken with fear, that good doctor was not daunted. Now, the confusion that ensued among the other guests of the house who had witnessed this extraordinary scene, who had beheld the pantomime of binding this struggling something, who had beheld me almost sinking from exhaustion when my task of jailer was over, well, the confusion and terror that possessed those bystanders was beyond description. I mean, the weaker ones fled from the apartment at once. The few who remained clustered around the door and could not be induced to approach Hammond and his charge. And you see, in some, incredulity broke through their horror. You know, they had not the courage to satisfy themselves, and yet still they doubted. I mean, it was in vain that I begged these men to convince themselves by touching of the existence in that room of a living, panting, invisible being. But they were incredulous, and yet they dared not undeceive themselves. I mean, how could a living, breathing body be invisible, they asked. And my reply was this. I gave a sign to Hammond, and both of us, conquering our repugnance at touching the invisible creature, lifted it up from the ground and took it to my bed. Now, its weight was about that of a boy of 14 years old. Now, my friends, I said, as Hammond and myself held the creature over the bed, behold the proof that here is a solid, ponderable body, which nevertheless you cannot see. Now, what's the surface of the bed? At a given signal, Hammond and I let the creature fall. There was a dull sound of a heavy body landing on a soft mass. The timbers of the bed creaked, and a deep impression marked itself distinctly on the pillow and the mattress. The crowd gave a low cry, "Ah!" and rushed out of the room, and Hammond and I were left alone with our mystery. I mean, we remained silent for some time, listening to the irregular breathing of the creature on the bed and watching the rustle of the bedclothes as it struggled to free itself from the rope. And then Hammond spoke. "Harry, this is awful." "Agreed," I said, "but not unaccountable." "What? Not unaccountable? What do you mean? Such a thing has never occurred since the birth of the world. I don't know what to think, Hammond. God grant that I'm not mad." Well, look at it this way, Harry," he said. "Look, here is a solid body which we touch, but which we cannot see. Now, the fact is so unusual that it strikes us with terror, but is there not a parallel for such a phenomenon? I mean, take a piece of pure glass. It's tangible and yet transparent. A certain chemical coarseness is all that prevents it from being so entirely transparent as to be totally invisible. It's not theoretically impossible, mind you, to make a glass which shall not reflect a single ray of light. A glass so pure and homogeneous in its atoms that the rays from the sun will pass right through it as they do through the air, refracted but not reflected. We don't see the air, and yet we feel that. All right, well, that's all very well, Hammond, I said, but these are inanimate substances. Glass doesn't breathe. Air doesn't breathe. This thing has a heart that palpitates, a will that moves it, lungs that inspire and respire. Well, you forget the phenomenon, he said, that we've heard so much of recently, of the so-called spirit circles. Yeah? Invisible hands have been thrust into the hands of those persons round the table, warm, fleshly hands that seem to pulsate with mortal life. What? I said. Well, you think then that this thing is, I don't know what it is, Harry, but please the gods, I will, with your assistance, thoroughly investigate it. Well, we watched together, smoking many pipes all night long by the bedside of the unearthly being that tossed and panted until it was apparently wearied out. And then we were deduced by the low, regular breathing that it had fallen asleep. The next morning, the house was all astir. The boarders congregated on the landing outside my room, and we had to answer 1,000 questions, for as yet not one person in the house except ourselves could be induced to set foot into my rooms. The creature was awake again now. This was evidenced by the convulsive manner in which the bedclothes were moved in its efforts to escape. There was something awful in those second-hand indications of an agonized struggle for liberty. Hammond and I, we'd racked our brains during the night to discover some means by which we might realize the shape and general appearance of the enigma. As well as we could make out by passing our hands over it, the creature's form was human. There was a mouth, a round, hairless head, a nose, which was, however, but little elevated above the cheeks, and hands and feet which felt like those of a boy. At first, we thought of placing the being on a smooth surface and tracing its outlines with chalk, as shoemakers trace the outlines of a foot, but that plan was soon abandoned. A happy thought then struck me that we could take a cast of it in plaster of Paris. This would give us a solid figure and satisfy all our wishes. But how could we do it? The movements of the creature would disturb the setting of the plaster covering and would always distort the mould. And then another thought, why not give it chloroform? No, well, it had respiratory organs, that was evident by its breathing, and once reduced to a state of insensibility, well, we could do with it what we would. So Dr. Cronk was sent for. And after that worthy physician had recovered from the first shock of amazement, he proceeded to administer the chloroform. Before 3 minutes had elapsed, we were able to remove the fetters from the creature's body, and Hammond and I were busy covering the invisible form with moist clay. In 5 minutes more, we had a mould, and before evening, we had a rough facsimile of the mystery. In shape, it was like a man. Distorted, uncouth and horrible, but still a man. I was small, not much over 4 feet in height, and its limbs revealed an extraordinary muscular development. Its face surpassed all hideousness. It was worse than anything I'd ever laid eyes upon or even imagined. Not Gustave Doré, not Goya could have conceived of anything as horrible as this. It was the physiognomy of what I fancy a ghoul must be. And it looked, well, it was almost certain that it fed on human flesh. Having satisfied our curiosity and bound everyone in the house to secrecy, the question could no longer be ignored. What was to be done? with this enigma. I mean, it was impossible that we should keep a horror like that in the house, yet it was equally impossible that such a thing should be let loose upon the world. I mean, I confess, I would have gladly voted for the creature's destruction, but who would shoulder that responsibility? Who would undertake the execution of this horrible semblance of a human being? I couldn't do that. Day after day, the question was debated. The other boarders all left the house. Mrs. Moffat was in despair herself, and she threatened Hammond and myself with all sorts of legal penalties if we did not remove the horror, to which our answer was, well, we will go if you like, Mrs. Moffat, but we will not take this creature with us. Remove it yourself, if you please. It appeared in your house. On your responsibility does it rest. I mean, to that, of course, there was no answer. Mrs. Moffat could not find for love or money anyone who would even go near the mystery. I mean, the most singular part of the affair was that we were entirely ignorant of what the creature fed on. I mean, everything in the way of nutriment that we could think of was placed before it, but it was never touched. I mean, it was awful to stand by day after day and see the bedclothes toss and hear the hard breathing and know that it was starving. 10, 12 days, a fortnight passed, and it still lived. But you see, the pulsations of the heart were daily growing fainter, and it was evident that the creature was dying for want of sustenance. Now, while this terrible life struggle was going on, I felt absolutely miserable. I couldn't sleep. I mean, horrible as the creature was, it was pitiful to think of the pangs that it was suffering. It was in the 3rd week that it died. Hammond and I found it cold and stiff one morning in bed. The heart had ceased to beat, the lungs to respire. So we buried it in the garden. It was a strange funeral. The dropping of that invisible corpse into the damp hole. The cast of its form I gave to Dr. Cronk, who keeps it in his private museum in town. And that concludes, what was it? By Fitz-James O'Brien. Now, if you enjoy this sort of thing and you'd like to support more of it, this will always be free to view, but if you'd like to become a patron of this YouTube storytelling strand, then you can do so by visiting patreon.com and searching for Robert Lloyd Parry, and you'll find various options there. Or you could make a one-off donation at the Nunkey website, nunkey.co.uk/contact. There's a PayPal button there. Now, if you'd like to learn more about and read more of Fitz-James O'Brien, of whom I've read very little but this story, then you could do much worse than get hold of a beautiful, definitive 3-volume edition of his complete ghost stories that's just been published by Swan River Press. I'm waiting for mine. Mine hasn't quite arrived from Dublin, where they're based. But if you go to Swan River Press website, you can find out a lot about Fitz-James O'Brien, and you can buy this remarkably beautiful 3-volume set of his weird works. The next thing along these lines will be a reading of a story by Desmond McCarthy called Pargeton and Harby. And I shall be telling you when that is on Facebook, etc., in the days to come. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed yourselves.